What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Young Guns podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about our NHL playoff predictions and odds once again, covering the Florida Panthers. Will they miss or make the playoffs? Currently, Florida is on a 5 game point streak and are very close to a wild card spot. They are 6-3-1 in their last 10 games and have just came off a 9-5 win versus the Montreal Canadiens, where 10 goals were scored in the first period. They are regarded as one of the best teams offensively. They're tied for fifth for goals. Their shots on goal, their first power play is 11th. Shooting percentage is 24th. Face-off percentage is not that great. It's at 23. And goals allowed, not so great.
Yeah.
23rd in the league. But they're a very disciplined team with you know, 30, ranked 31st place in the league. So this is a team that obviously is more offensively minded. This is a team that won the President's Trophy last season, but they're not exactly the same team in terms of the standings. They lost Jonathan Huberdeau and they lost Mackenzie Weegar during the offseason, but they bring in Matthew Tkachuk, who's having an MVP season, but they're clearly disappointing in terms of comparing last year's team to this year's team. And Luca, what are your thoughts on the Florida Panthers? Will they make the playoffs?
Well, I look at the remaining games that they have. They're playing New Jersey today at 6 o'clock, and then they have Detroit and Philly, which are two beatable teams. They play Toronto 3 times during this span, which is going to be very interesting. But they have some winnable games. I mean, listen, they're playing, like I said, Detroit and Philly right after New Jersey. They play Ottawa once. They play Montreal and Columbus again, and Buffalo. They actually play Ottawa twice. So they're in a position where they can easily get 6 or 7 wins, right? And obviously, we talked about that with Buffalo, but they're only 3 points behind Pittsburgh and the Islanders for a wild card spot. Pittsburgh hasn't been at their best. The Islanders have been better lately, but Pittsburgh hasn't really been at their best. And obviously, it's still an open race in the playoffs. I know Washington is still tech too, in terms of making the playoffs. So there's definitely an opportunity there for Florida to take advantage. The thing is that my biggest concern with Florida, it's been the biggest concern I think all season. This team can score goals. Nobody can take that away from Florida. They're one of the best offensive teams in the league. They're sixth in the league for goals forward, like you mentioned. But to me, it's going to come down to defensive games. And obviously Brandon Montour's had a really good season, 56 points, 66 games. He's been a real revelation for them. He plays about 24 minutes a night, and has probably been their best defenseman. Gustav Forsling as well has been really good, but Aaron Ekblad's been kind of disappointing. And then you look at their depth on defense. Their numbers aren't horrible, but they're letting in a lot of goals, and a lot of that has to do with goaltending, and it also has to do with defensively just not playing well. Sergei Bobrovsky, as much as he's got 22 wins, 17 losses, and 3 overtime losses, he's got a 903 save percentage. He's only got one shutout. He's got 303 goals against average. Like, for a guy you're paying $10.5 million or $10 million, you expect better from that goaltender. Obviously, Spencer Knight, he's currently out because he's in the NHL Player Assistance Program. He didn't have a really good season before that anyways. He only had a 901. And then Alex Lyon, who has played 6 games for them and has been the backup, but I think he's injured now, or he was sent back down to the minors. 3 wins, 2 losses, 1 overtime loss, 887. So this is really a situation where Florida defensively and in net just haven't been good enough. And I think that that's ultimately going to play a factor in their next 13 games coming up. Is a question of, are they going to be able to figure that out? In a game against Montreal, yeah, they scored 9 goals. They also let in 5, right? The game before that against the Jets, they lost 5-4 in overtime. And then the game after that against Chicago, they still let in 3 goals against the worst team in the league. Before that, though, 4-3 win, 4-1 win, 4-1 win, 2-1 win. They were playing well, and it just seems like they're kind of going back down to earth. And when they lose by, 2-3 goals, usually as a difference, sometimes even 4 goals. So I think for Florida, it's going to be interesting to see what happens between game 69 and game 82, as it's the last game of the season. And obviously it starts tonight against New Jersey. And it's going to be interesting because, yeah, Florida's beaten a lot of teams that, um, have made the play are in the playoffs. They've also lost to a lot of teams that are currently in the playoffs. They beat Vegas, they beat Pittsburgh, they beat Tampa recently. They ended up beating Minnesota in a shootout. They've beaten Tampa twice actually in the last 15, 20 games. So they've played well. But I think what's interesting too is that you got to look at it and say, look, they're playing Toronto 3 times, which is going to be a tough test for them. They're playing New Jersey tonight. They're playing the Rangers. They're playing Carolina. And as much as yes, they're still playing. As much as Ottawa hasn't really played at their best, Ottawa's still a team that you don't want to underestimate. And they're still playing Buffalo during that time, which is probably going to be their biggest game of the season, right? So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Florida. I know they've dealt with injuries. I know they've got guys back. Duclair's only played 6 games. They've had a lot of guys that have underachieved, but Matthew Tkachuk's been basically their best player all season, and he's the reason they are where they are. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them. But if Tkachuk can continue doing what he's doing, and if Barkov can find his game a little bit more and stay healthy, I think this is a team that can continue to try to make the playoffs. And obviously, Carter Verhaeghe has been a big story as well since he's got 34 goals this season. So they have the depth. I do think they have the depth to do it. It's just a matter of, are they going to be able to be consistent enough to do it? And that's the question with Florida that's been, kind of been the issue all season.
Yeah, and Bill Zito has done such a great job as their general manager the last couple of years. It was kind of disappointing that they stood pat during the deadline. They didn't really do anything, or they didn't do anything at all. And it was kind of worrisome where they were just like, you know, do we trade a guy like maybe Sam Bennett or Anthony Duclair or Sam Reinhart? Because there was rumblings about that. Even Gudas at one point, there's rumblings about moving him. And they just said, you know what? We're gonna keep the same team and fight for a playoff spot, which was honestly the best decision in my opinion because they're a couple of points away. Matthew Tkachuk, I think we'd all agree that was a fantastic addition. He's about to have another 100-point campaign, and this is with a new team, not the team that he was with for the last couple of seasons, which was the Calgary Flames. So he's been fitting in very well, and people could have a huge debate if they won that deal, if they lost that deal. As of right now, the way that Kachuk's been playing, they won the deal. Huberto, McKenzie, Uyghur have been very underwhelming, and it sucks to say that, but Calgary's not in a playoff spot, and I don't think they're going to make the playoffs, unfortunately. Even though I would have liked to see them, since we're fellow Canadians and we support Canadian teams, but Florida has a better shot of making the playoffs than the Calgary Flames, and a big reason because of that is Matthew Tkachuk, and a big reason why Calgary's not in a playoff spot and may not make the playoffs is because of Huberto not being the player that he's supposed to be, and Mackenzie Weegar not being the player he's supposed to be. So those are important factors to take into consideration. Not only that, I do agree with you with the whole defensive aspect of their game. It's not the greatest. We saw how much they've added over the last couple of years, especially at last year's deadline. And this year they didn't really do anything. And I think that's the one position they should have added is maybe a defenseman. And the market this year was huge for defensive minded defensemen, and they didn't make any moves, unfortunately. So this is a team most likely heading into the playoffs if they make the playoffs. And I don't believe this is a team that will do that much damage. They're a team that's going to score a lot of goals in the first round of the series if they make the playoffs. But there's a very high chance they face teams like Boston, New Jersey, or the Hurricanes in the first round. And I do believe that those teams are more complete and more balanced and will give the Florida Panthers a very hard time. Just looking at their defense very quickly, it doesn't scream anything amazing. Mark Stahl's up there in age, and sure he's been having a pretty okay season, but this is a defensive core that will get destroyed, unfortunately, versus teams like the Boston Bruins, Hurricanes, or the Devils.
Well, I think Florida's such a weird team, okay? Because I think on paper they're not that bad. They're supposed to be a lot better than what they're supposed to be. And I think the Eastern Conference this year has been really good, which has also kind of tampered with Florida. We kind of expected Florida to have a regression season this year. We didn't expect them to miss the playoffs, but there was a lot of people hoping that there would be after they hired Paul Maurice. And I don't think that Paul Maurice is an answer long term for this team, especially if they have ambitions of winning a Stanley Cup. But and I think that he has, his coaching style has played a factor in Florida being where they are right now. But I look at their team, and to be honest, I'm not gonna lie to you, like they're not that intimidating. And like you said, right, they're gonna probably end up playing Boston if they make the playoffs, Carolina or New Jersey. And I don't think they beat either any one of those teams. I don't think Bobrovsky in general has been good enough that, because for me, I think when I look at the team in the playoffs and when I analyze teams that go into the playoffs, the first thing I look at is goaltending. The reason I look at goaltending is because no matter what happens in any playoff series, if your goaltender is not good enough, you're not winning games, right? Like your goaltender needs to be at his best. And the problem is that Bobrovsky has not been at his best, not only this season, but for the last couple of years. I know last year he had a good year, and he played well. Obviously, Spencer Knight played well too, so it ended up doing that. But Florida didn't go far in the playoffs. They got they were bounced pretty quickly. And so for me, I don't think I'm big on Florida's team in terms of why they didn't add at the deadline. Look, they don't have assets. They traded away 3 first-round picks, and they don't really have the prospects apart from maybe Maki Samaskevich, and obviously Grigory Denisenko. But besides that, they didn't really have anybody else to trade for or to trade away, because they're kind of in that weird boat where they're like, are they good enough, or is it just a situation of like they're legitimately at this point, like from what I see, being carried? Because if you think about it, Tkachuk, and if you go look at his stats, Matthew Tkachuk, I know stats don't say the whole picture, but like Matthew Tkachuk's got 91 points in 65 games. The second highest point totals on the team is Carter Verhaeghe with 59 and 67, which means Matthew Tkachuk has 32 more points than the second highest player on the team, right? And to me, regardless of the fact that there's 3 guys on this team, technically 4 if you count Sam Reinhart, that have 50 points, it's still not good enough. It's not good enough if you're a team that is solely reliant on Matthew Tkachuk. And a lot of the reason why, Verhaeghe has this many points, Montour has this many points, and Reinhardt has 49 points is because Tkachuk's been there, right? So yeah, I'm not criticizing what Florida's done. The acquisition of Matthew Tkachuk's been great, but the acquisition of Matthew Tkachuk is the reason Florida are where they are, right? And Matthew Tkachuk's having such a career year that like nobody really expected him to have this good of a year, but at the same time, like he's the only reason Florida is, let's say, relevant at this point of the season. If Matthew Tkachuk has 67 points, we're not talking about Florida making the playoffs, right? The reason he's doing so well is because Florida can score their problems away, right? They let in 6 goals a game, but they score 7, right? Look at the Habs game as an example. I know that it's a one-off technically, but it's not, right? Go look at the games that they've played over the last, I would say, last 10 games, and I'll read you some of the scores. It's absolutely ridiculous, just in terms of like games that they've won or lost, right? They lost 7-3 to Nashville, right? Then they go beat Tampa 7-1. They lose 5-3 to Colorado. They lose 6-2 to St. Louis. They beat Montreal 9-5. They lose 5-4 to Winnipeg. They lost in early in February. They lost 7-6 to Pittsburgh in overtime. They lost 6-2 to the Rangers, right? Yes, they're winning games 6-2 as well and 7-1 and stuff like that. But the games that they lose, like Boston, they lost 7-3. You know what I mean? Like they're losing games by letting in 6-7 goals a game. Like you can't win games like that in the playoffs. That's not what it's going to be, right? And
Yeah.
so for me, I think no matter what, like yes, Florida's got good offense. I think that they're a team that can squeak into the playoffs, but ultimately, I don't think they're that good. I think a lot of it has to do with Matthew Tkachuk just being really good and not necessarily complementing the team. And I know Florida fans may look at this comment and say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," but dude, like it to me it doesn't make sense, and I don't want to be disrespectful. I know Montreal hasn't been the best, but like letting in 5 goals to the Montreal Canadiens, to me personally, especially with the team that they iced on 21 shots, like that to me is concerning for a fan, regardless of the fact that you won 9-5, that your goaltender let in 5 goals on 21 shots. To me, that's very concerning, especially since Sergei Bobrovsky is getting paid the money that he's getting paid. To see him let in 5 goals on 21 shots is very, very, very embarrassing.
And I'll
And
yeah.
he hasn't been that good. 903 save percentage is terrible. For a goalie that's getting paid the money that he's getting paid, it's terrible. And that's the problem with Florida, is that if they don't get their goaltending together and if they don't get their defense together, they're gonna they're gonna be swept in floor. Like I don't even care about the fact that they can score 7 goals a game. It does not matter in the playoffs. That's not what it's gonna be,
Sure.
and they
Yeah.
have to figure that out.
Sure, they could get themselves to the playoffs by outscoring opponents, but in the playoffs, the healthiest and most balanced team makes it the furthest. And unfortunately, in this case, I don't think that's the case for Florida. I don't think they go that far if they do
No.
make the playoffs. Where they finish, essentially, I do believe that they could pass the Islanders. Maybe even the Pittsburgh Penguins. So it's really up to debate if they finish first or second. But it doesn't matter who they face, because the team that they will face, either Boston, New Jersey or the Hurricanes are going to be the favorites to win any series against the Florida Panthers, and they're going to have to really solidify their defensive core and get goaltending in check. And hopefully Spencer Knight comes back beforehand, because I don't believe that Bobrovsky could do it all by himself. Not only that, a couple of things I would like to say in terms of statistics. It's nice to see Eric Stahl, especially at the age that he's at, having a 24-point campaign in 58 games. Same thing with Nick Cousins, 24 points in 65 games. Like, seeing depth, having over 20 points is definitely interesting to see. Colin White, he's a reclamation project, not having the best season. Radko Gudas normally has, puts up better points, even though he's more defensively minded. Not too impressed with his game. Mark Stahl is up there in age, so it's totally understandable. But Patrick Hornquist, when healthy, really regressed a lot. Not the player that he once was. So clearly, there's been
He's probably gonna end up retiring though at the end of the year. So
we'll see what happens there. But clearly, they're not the same President's Trophy team as they were last year. There's a lot of players that regressed and dropped their game. Aaron Ekblad, I would say that injuries do play a factor in why he's minus 15 and he's not having the greatest season ever. Even though the last two seasons, he was playing fantastic, and a lot of people were saying that he was very underrated, and I still believe he's underrated. Just that overall as a whole, Florida hasn't been playing the best. But I do believe that going with Paul Maurice was not the right choice. I think they should have kept Andrew Brunette, where they were doing really good under him. I mean, ultimately, or ideally, essentially, Joel Quenneville would have been the best fit, and they were doing amazing under him. But with the whole controversy that happened, they had no choice to let him go, because they're going to get a lot of slander if they kept him. So they go with Andrew Brunette, and I know he got in trouble recently with the law, but he would have been fantastic and the ideal choice to remain as the coach of the Florida
yeah,
Panthers. But they lost a lot of key pieces from last year's President's Trophy team, like Huberto and Mackenzie Weegar. They were a part of that. They lost that, but they did gain Kachuk, which is an improvement. But their defense took a hit because
and
of that. Sherratt didn't do anything crazy, let's be honest here, so it's not really the biggest loss. But Claude Giroux was a good fit, but he decided to go back to his home city, which was the Ottawa Senators, and play for them and probably retire with
yeah,
them. So clearly, you lost a lot of key pieces, so it's understandable why there was a little bit of a step back. But at the end of the day, I do believe that they have a very good shot at making the playoffs. I think at this point, it's really between Florida, Pittsburgh, and the Islanders at this point. And any of those teams need to gear up and make sure that, defensively and offensively and goaltending wise, of course, that they're ready to take on the likes of Boston, New Jersey, or the Hurricanes,
in
because
my
those
in
are going to
my
be hard
very
teams to face.
in my very biased opinion, I want Florida not to make the playoffs.
Well, I mean,
In
we'll
my
see what
very
happens
in
there.
my very biased opinion, yes, guys, biased opinion, because let's be honest, I'm a Habs fan. We're Habs fans, and if Florida misses the playoffs, it helps the Canadians out. Um, anyway, so for me, like, listen, I think they can make the playoffs. I'm gonna be on Florida fans' side here and say they probably will edge out either Pittsburgh or the Islanders to do it. But if they don't, I won't be sad for them either, because we have their first round pick. So
Yeah.
if they can lose as many games from now at the end of the season, that just benefits
Out of
Montreal.
out
It's
of
not they're
out of all
trying to
the
be
teams out of all the teams on the bubble to make the playoffs in
yeah,
the East,
I
the
think
Islanders
Florida
have been
can.
the Islanders have been the most consistent, and right, behind them, I would say Pittsburgh and Florida are tied. But Pittsburgh and Florida, have been conceding a lot of goals as of late. So it's really, I think it's going to be end up between those two teams who make the playoffs for the last spot. And I do believe that the Islanders at this point are most likely going to be a lock. And yeah, so guys, make sure to write your thoughts in the comment section below. Do the Florida Panthers make the playoffs, or do they miss the playoffs? What are key pieces for the Florida Panthers to rely on heading into the playoffs? What do they have to adjust heading to the playoffs to face the likes of Boston, the Devils, or the Hurricanes? And make sure to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And we'll see you in the next episode of the Young Guns podcast. Thank you so much for watching.